Well, what would do US corporations want? They want markets abroad. They want raw materials abroad. They want investment outlets abroad, and they want cheap labor, which in our time particularly, but it has always been true, comes from abroad. I often think that people think migration and population is something completely disconnected with capitalism, but this is not so. Everybody who thinks so should read, I forget which chapter it is. I think it's chapter 25 of Capital, which is called The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. And most people would imagine that a chapter so entitled would be about, quantities of capital and the return on that and so on. No, it isn't about that. It's about population. And if you read that chapter carefully, you will see that you will conclude no migration, no capitalism. Capitalism cannot do without migration. It is impossible for it to exist, and you will discover why in that chapter. The overwhelming majority of thinking people tended to side with parties of the left, and in fact, so much so that there's somewhere, I forget where it is now, but John Stuart Mill calls the Conservative Party the stupid party, and the Liberal Party and later on the Labour Party were the thinking man's party, right? This connection is now broken. And the way in which it broke is also interesting, because over time, what happened is, on the one hand, yes, well, first of all, the professional managerial class expanded, and that is effectively the intellectual class today. It has expanded massively. And so much so that it has now taken over all politics, in the sense that whether you look at conservative parties or the Republicans or the Democrats, whether you look at the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, they're dominated not by, the Conservatives are not dominated by business people and so on. The Labour Party is not dominated by workers. They are all, as parties, who are their MPs? They are lawyers, doctors, professionals, professors, whatever they are. That's who they are. These people essentially have, and you see, this shift began to occur in the 1970s, I would say. And this then shifted conservative parties to the neoliberal right. And then rather than fighting them from the left, the historic parties of the working class also shifted to the right. And they are now part of this, as I say, the same sort of intellectual class. And like I say, so that's one thing. And for shifting to the right, essentially, they sort of, for historic parties of the left, what they did is they accepted neoliberalism, but then added on it a layer of what I call social liberalism, a very tokenistic social liberalism, in which you say you care about women and Black people and so on, but you only deal with that by promoting a small number of them tokenistically to prominent positions. But everybody else, their situation does not change, so they remain as they are.
Welcome to another Class Unity Speaker Series event. Class Unity is a Marxist organization that supports class struggle politics here in the United States. We believe in class politics, not identity politics. Our aim is to build a coalition that would establish a workers' party here in the United States. If you would like to support us, please consider giving us a donation, or even better, by joining us. You can do either by going to our website, classunity.org. And now for our main event. Our political education program is concerned with promoting materialist analysis on politics, economics, and social issues. Part of that program is our speaker series. Today, we will be speaking to Professor Radhika Desai. She is professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba. She is the author of numerous books, including Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire in 2013, which we will be discussing today, and numerous articles in Economic and Political Weekly, New Left Review, Third World Quarterly, and other journals, and in edited collections on parties, political economy, culture, and nationalism. She is also the convener of the International Manifesto Group, which discusses the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of the world order and its national and regional components at the beginning of the pandemic. Radhika Desai has proposed geopolitical economy as an approach to understanding the capitalist world order and the rise of multipolarity, and has refined it further in her new book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. Today's conversation will be centered around her 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, as well as her 2015 article, Geopolitical Economy, The Discipline of Multipolarity. These together critique the dominant theories of U.S. hegemony, globalization, and empire, and argue for a new discipline, geopolitical economy, which is better able to understand the multipolar world, reconstruct its historical evolution, and assess its progressive potential. Professor Desai, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Just to start us off, could you introduce your book? What is your book about? What topics do you explore? Why do you believe that we need a new discipline, geopolitical economy?
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who's here. It's very nice to discuss my ideas with you, people who are interested in them. So yeah, that's really great. Okay, so geopolitical economy. Well, geopolitical economy, let me rephrase that. I have always been dissatisfied with the idea of globalization. I never thought I was actually around when it first emerged. I had just become a newly minted assistant professor in the early 90s. And by the mid 90s, the word globalization was really doing the rounds. By the late 90s, you just couldn't discuss anything without mentioning globalization. And I have always been among the small band of people like Robert Wade, or I'm trying to think, I think Hurston Thompson, Robert Wade, Linda Weiss, and many others who always questioned the notion of globalization, because globalization implied that the state has become irrelevant. And so on. So I decided that I was going to write a critique of globalization. And as I started doing my research, the reason for my dissatisfaction is that I think that the state has always been involved in the economy in capitalist countries, and neoliberalism did not roll back the state. The state remained as involved. It is up to its elbows in the capitalist economy. What had changed is the orientation and the purposes of state intervention, whereas in the previous era, in the Keynesian welfare state era, it was somewhat oriented towards some notion of popular welfare. Under neoliberalism, it became entirely oriented towards the notion of corporate welfare, capitalist welfare, etc. So anyway, so this was my dissatisfaction all along. I thought I would write a book in which I used the idea of US hegemony in order to critique globalization, in the following sense, that I was going to portray it as a strategy in the United States' attempt to manage its hegemonic decline. However, as I tried to research the matter further, I realized that the idea of US hegemony was also deeply problematic. So this then put me on a learning curve, and I realized that you cannot, in fact, just as with both concepts, US hegemony as well as globalization, there are as many definitions of these phenomenon as there are writers, if not more, because each writer changes his mind, and they're like slippery eels. You can't get hold of what they're trying to say. So in the end, my book also turned into a critique of the notion of US hegemony. And essentially then I realized that what I was doing was actually criticizing all notions of economic cosmopolitanism. Everybody all traditions of thought which think that the world economy is a single seamless whole. Okay. So both US hegemony, globalization, 19th century ideas of free trade, and also I should have added that, of course, from the very beginning, I was very influenced not just by Keynesian ideas and Keynesian welfare state understandings of the role of the state in the economy, but also developmental state ideas. There is a long tradition of critiquing free trade ideas, going back to Friedrich List, Alexander Hamilton, and so on and so forth. And I was completely convinced that practically, in fact, without qualification, every form of development that we have seen, witnessed in the world today, of what Ha-Joon Chang calls the now developed countries, every one of them has used an extensive array of state interventionist methods to achieve its development. So then why are we talking about globalization? What do we mean? What do you mean US hegemony? Because the difference between the two is not great. As I like to put it, in globalization, no state matters, and the whole world is united seamlessly by markets. And in US hegemony and ideas of successive hegemonies, before the US, there was the UK, and before that, there was Holland, and before that, there were the Italian city-states. These ideas essentially assume that a single state unifies the world economy, but having done so, the world economy itself remains a seamless whole. And so the notions of this seamlessly whole world economy, in which nation states don't matter, national economies don't matter, borders don't matter, etc., are what I call problematic. So I needed a different way of understanding the world economy. And in my searches, then I stumbled upon the idea of uneven and combined development, which I had been vaguely familiar with. I had come across Michael Lowy's book on the subject many years ago, but I refamiliarized myself with it. But then I was also very very dissatisfied with the way in which uneven and combined development is deployed. So basically, most Marxists, and now I'm speaking as a Marxist because I was always writing this book as a Marxist. So most Marxists actually subscribe to some notion either of globalization or US hegemony, if you think about it. Either they, for example, Justin Rosenberg wrote a whole book in which was a critique of globalization. But what was the substance of the critique? The substance of the critique is that everybody who in the late 20th century started talking about globalization had arrived too late. Marx was the first theorist of globalization. Look at the Communist Manifesto, capital goes everywhere and, nestles everywhere and converts the world into its own image and blah, blah, and so on. Of course, he didn't manage to read past the first 10, 15 pages of the manifesto, because if he had, he would have come up with a very different idea of what Marx was saying. But anyway, so Marxists either accept that, or people like Leo Panitch are big, they beat the drum of US hegemony, etc. So they also subscribe to cosmopolitan views, but I don't think that was Marx's view. But anyway, in uneven and combined development, either they never talk about the idea of uneven and combined development, or if they do, many of them, like, for instance, David Harvey, they just use the word uneven development to refer to the fact that the world is unequal. There is a small part of the world that is highly developed. The rest of the world is not. And as far as they're concerned, that's the problem of the rest of the world. The first world has just developed, because its genius is capitalism, and so basically like modernization theory, if you think about it. So they use uneven development. Then those who use uneven and combined development take combined development either to just mean the kind of juxtaposition of developed and less developed institutions and regions and so on. So they just assume that they just coexist, or they assume that combined development is really about what the Russian Revolution was about. That is skipping an entire stage, so you go from feudalism to socialism, and that's combined development. But if you look closely at what Trotsky wrote in the Locus Classicus of the idea of uneven and combined development, which is chapter 1 of the history of the Russian Revolution, it's very clear that he believes that uneven development is, of course, just simply the fact that capitalism does not develop in the whole world all at once. It develops in lumps and clumps, and some countries develop further. But then once some parts of the world develop, they create certain imperatives for the rest of the world. And, to the so-called whip of external necessity. And so basically, it presents the rest of the world with a choice. Either you industrialize behind protectionist walls using state intervention, etc., or you remain underdeveloped and you become even more underdeveloped. So that's what Germany did. That's what, and Trotsky even takes the example of Germany being more advanced than Britain, who, Germany enjoying the advantages of backwardness while Britain suffering from the disadvantages of being first, basically, the disadvantages of priority. Anyway, so to me, the correct interpretation of uneven and combined development is to see combined development as a form of state-directed development. So, and this is where also I join Marxism and developmental state thinking. And so, in the end, basically, what I have come up with in geopolitical economy, and this is something much more clear in my second book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, but it's also there in geopolitical economy, is that really you cannot understand the world economy without understanding it as, the dialectic of uneven and combined development is nothing more than the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism. If you want to contest imperial domination, the only way of doing it is via some form of combined, that is to say, state-directed development, and that can take capitalist forms. That took capitalist forms until 1917, and thereafter it also took socialist forms in the form of the Soviet development and later Chinese development, and so on and so forth. So to me, the ideas of globalization, US empire, I mean, today everybody and their dog is talking about the reversal of globalization, deglobalization, the decline of US hegemony. But and just a couple more points and before I stop. So my argument, so I lay down this theoretical framework, and then I basically proceed to point out that US hegemony never existed. Because thanks to uneven and combined development, thanks to the combined development efforts of the of various powers, the world had already become multipolar by the late 19th century. And the United States had the misfortune of trying to emulate British-style dominance over the world economy at a time when that emulation had become impossible. And then in much of the book, because so much of idea of US hegemony hangs on the idea of making the dollar the world's money, I present a critique of the contradictions of the dollar system and how it has never served stably as the world's money. So that's another part of it. And so, and if you have an idea of uneven and combined development, you can also explain multipolarity much better, because once you have this conception, what you realize is that you cannot describe the world economy in terms of free trade and markets spreading all around the world, or globalization essentially making the whole world capitalist in some uniform fashion, the world is flat, etc. Nor can you understand it as a succession of hegemonies. Rather, the best way to understand the world economy since the advent of capitalism is to see it as a spreading multipolarity. As more and more countries, there are not that many, but as more and more countries successfully pursue combined development, and since by the late 20th century also, it was very clear that the most successful among these were the socialist countries, China being today the foremost among them. That so some form of combined development is the only way to develop, and that is also an imperative for societies if they wish to escape underdevelopment. And so to me, that is what explains multipolarity much better, because when people started talking about multipolarity, traditions like US hegemony, globalization were simply unable to explain it. So that, in a nutshell, is a kind of a summary of what I'm arguing.
Thank you so much. Let's go into questions. If you have a question, best to type it into the chat or raise your hand, like so. We'll start with Daniel.
Hi, Radhika. Thank you very much. I was wondering, so I really enjoyed your book. It's really it's an incredible presentation of the history, political history, economic history, a theory. It's really impressive. And I want to ask something to sort of simplify for our members and viewers, because it can seem like the sheer the quantity of detail and the richness of the theory can be kind of overwhelming. So I want to sort of simplify something, and it's just kind of my impression, and then invite you to correct it or elaborate on it. One thing that struck me reading your book and your essay was that it seems like there are two camps, sort of, and you're saying that each one sort of gets something right, but they miss the bigger picture in different ways. You have political realists on the one hand who say, well, basically what we have are states. They're the political actors. They're nations. Internationally, it's a system of anarchy. You know, as John Mearsheimer likes to say, at the national level, there's no one to call 911 when something goes wrong. It's just violence, and it's usually military. So that's just national, direct political violence, and kind of the economy gets ignored. For instance, Mearsheimer doesn't really have a lot to say about the role of the dollar. On the other hand, you have this group of people, sometimes liberal cosmopolitans, certainly the laissez-faire capitalism types, free markets, but also often Marxists, who say, you know, what there is a global economic system. Globalization isn't new. It goes all the way back to the ancient world. And states are really sort of just second order, supervenient, kind of emergent systems. What's really fundamental are market systems. And it's a global order. And it's always been this way. And so you're saying, no, there's something between these. At least this is my impression that I would like to hear your thoughts on. There's something between these. So there is always a sort of bigger system in which a nation is sort of contextualized. And that's capitalism now. But on the other hand, financial assets, obligations, debts, currencies, these things are always denominated in a monetary unit of account, which is issued by a state. So the state is always going to be involved. And there's no, for instance, money without the financial dimension. There's no capital without that. And so there will never be capitalism without the state. And there are many states. It's not just one. And so we need something between these. At least that was kind of my impression. So the world will always be multipolar. At least that's how it's looking. The state will always be involved, but there will always be a bigger system as well. Is this even approximating to the way you see the world?
Well, let me respond to all those points, because and then come back to discussing your what I think is your summary of what I'm saying. But let me clarify a few things first. So first of all, let me say that, you know, geopolitical economy is basically it's a critique of globalization empire, which are the two paradigms that dominate international political economy, which is a kind of a sister discipline of, or a separate discipline than international relations. So now in international political economy, you do have people, you know, when people teach it, it's an odd sort of discipline, but when people teach it, they do say, you know, there is a realist tradition and then there is the liberal cosmopolitan. So they basically replicate the international relations model. But in fact, you know, first of all, international political economy isn't actually political economy. It is basically neoclassical economics writ large. Most of them accept some notion of cosmopolitanism that I've said. And that's why, insofar as they discuss politics at all, it is always as politics interfering in the normal and proper workings of the market, you know. So, you know, unions and certain weak business sectors are responsible for protectionism. Otherwise, you would never have, protectionism, etc. So politics is a residual element in international political economy, which is generally a free market, endorsement of free market, and therefore liberal cosmopolitan views. Now, so realism is kind of a odd thing. So to me, let me first of all simply say that I should probably write, as a companion piece to my work so far, a critique of realism in international relations. Because to me, realism has always been a way of excusing the United States, because remember, realism emerges more or less alongside, in the 20th century, excusing United States and also other imperialist countries' international aggression. Because if you say that all countries do the same or would do the same if they had the power, then you don't have to explain why the United States is so internationally aggressive. And more recently, I've also pointed out that, John Mearsheimer, since you mentioned him, they have written this book, The Israel Lobby. Because, why did they write? I'm not saying the Israel lobby is not powerful. I'm sure they donate lots of money to lots of Congress people and so on. But it is systematically necessary for them to write this book. Why? Because if they don't write this book, they cannot explain why the United States behaves in ways that are so contrary to what they would construe as the national interest of the United States. What this forgets, however, is that the United States is essentially, what this forgets actually is that the United States does this because capitalism is inseparable from imperialism, and the United States is also an imperial state or a would-be imperialist state. So that its international aggression is not explained by the normal realist billiard ball view of the international system, anarchy, blah, blah, etc. There is not anarchy in the world in the sense in which they mean it, actually. There are patterns. So they do not understand. What they lack is a concept of imperialism. They got as far as understanding that states are important. But what they don't understand is that states are not just shells. States are defined by the classes who stand behind them. Whose class power does a given state secure? That question does not even occur to a realist, right? So to me, the first theory, when you take international relations, as I'm sure you all did if you took in political science, when you take a first class in international relations, one of the first things you're taught is that international relations sort of has its roots in Wilsonian idealism, which lamentably failed, and then you had realism, and so on. And they even cite this, E.H. Carr's book, The 20 Years Crisis, and I'll come back to E.H. Carr later. So they say, that this is what happened. So the first theories of international relations really emerged essentially from American academics. No, it's simply not true. The first theories of the systematic theories of the international relations of the capitalist world were the works on imperialism that were published in the early 20th century by essentially Marxists, by Luxemburg, by Hilferding, by Lenin, by Bukharin. What were they trying to do? They were trying to understand how capitalism operated on the international plane. Why were you seeing rising imperialist competition, etc., etc.? How could you explain them in relation to the capitalist character of the states involved? And elements, they were not I think elements of uneven and combined development are also to be found in Marx, and I have written about this, and if you're interested, I can share a couple of essays that I have written on this subject. But anyway, so to me, those are the first theories. So you cannot have an understanding of the world system since the beginning of capitalism unless you understand imperialism. And once you understand imperialism, you must also understand anti-imperialism. Right? So so to me, and also then the other thing I should add to this, because I made a list of things I wanted to say. I mean, liberal cosmopolitanism I have already criticized, so we don't have to criticize that. You pointed out that, people say that globalization is supposed to have existed since ancient times. No, if you read the literature on globalization, it is exceedingly maddening for a number of ways. And one of them is because, like I say, everybody defines it in whatever way they think fit at that particular point in time. So, there are some say, globalization began in the, say, in the 90s, or some will say in the 80s, basically with neoliberalism. Some will say it began in the post-Second World War period. Some others will say there are two waves of globalization. One was peaked in 1914, and the next one is now, in formation, sort of thing. Of course, this is complete rubbish, because what peaked in 1914 was imperialism, not globalization. What do you mean globalization? It's a way of not talking about imperialism, So the date, and then some will say globalization began some millennia ago. I remember under Gunter Frank, I don't know what stage he was in, but basically, no, actually, he was not talking about globalization. He was talking about capitalism. But anyway, he said we've had capitalism since Lucy, meaning the first humanoid that walked the earth. I mean, that is simply not a tenable point of view. So to me, the dating of globalization itself is, very peculiar. And, as I say, anything and everything becomes globalization. If you see a hamburger, if you see McDonald's in Beijing, you say, look, globalization, I mean, that's not why there's a hamburger joint in Beijing. But anyway, okay. And then also I would say that two other things. Number one, you earlier, you were talking about your project Class Unity and how class politics is important. But I would say that you must also add, if you want to be properly Marxist, imperial. Class and nation are both important. Imperialism is as important as capitalism. The two cannot be separated. And there are too many ways of understanding, and too many people on the Western left think of class, but they never think of imperialism and nation. So that is problematic. And Marx, they would say that Marx did not write very much about imperialism, but it's true because his work was unfinished. But what he did write about imperialism took it very seriously. And elements, as I say, of uneven and combined development of the understanding of imperialism that is in all these later Marxist works that I refer to are already there in Marx. Marx's approach cannot be described as economics or politics or anything. Marx's approach was, he called it a critique of political economy. So he was within a broadly political economy tradition, but he was criticizing the existing limitations of political economy. And this is very important because precisely 3 years, or roughly, after Marx's Capital was published in German, you had the marginalist revolution in economics, the birth of neoclassical economics. And the birth of neoclassical economics did two things. Number one, it separated out the economy from the rest of society. So there's economy and society, and then there's the political sphere and whatnot. So you got and then Weber justified this further by saying that because these are separate spheres, we should study them separately. So there's economics and sociology and political science and what have you. And he said that this is because these spheres acquire an autonomy of their own in modern life, which was, Weber used the word modern where he often should have used the word capitalist, but let's leave that. So in modern life, these spheres acquire an autonomy, so we must study them separately. But people, if you examine this closely, what you will find is that the sphere whose autonomy Weber is most worried about is the economy. He basically, knowing that there is an organized working class now demanding things from the state, to say that you should leave the economy well alone, don't interfere with it, don't interfere with the market, is the best way of resisting working class demands for this, that, or the other, whether it's for high wages or welfare or pensions or unemployment benefit, compensation, blah, blah, etc. So This is the beginning of the what I call the social scientific division of labor. But that also did another thing, which is that all the social sciences that were born at this point and from this point onward are all ahistorical. They all assume that basically the same system repeats itself. But Marx was nothing if not historical. Marx understood that capitalism was a new and distinctive phase in its history, and capitalism itself had a history. It would have a beginning and an end, right? So to me, all these international relations is part of the larger discipline of so-called political science, which tries to separate something called politics or international politics from something called economics or international economics. This is not possible. There is that distinction, and thereby international relations, no matter which tradition you belong to, if you actually study international relations itself, then you have a problem. You have to understand the international relations of the capitalist world as being governed by the states of the capitalist world. And remember, I'm not saying all capitalist states, because after 1917, all states were not capitalist. And even before 1917, there are some states that were pre-capitalist. But a world whose dynamics began to be governed by the existence of certain powerful capitalist states in it. So that is, and then, so now I've made all my clarifications. Now I'll just say that, you were right. I actually do agree that states make money. Or rather, let me rephrase that. You can't have money without states. States don't necessarily make money completely. I'm not a chartalist in that sense. But I would say that money actually, one of my other points is that the capitalism demands of states many things which are contradictory. And the creation and maintenance of stable money is one of them. Now, capitalism itself requires, at the international level, some medium of exchange. And when Marx was writing, actually, that medium of exchange was basically gold. And that meant that there was no money at the international level, because gold is a commodity. It is not a money. Money and commodities are opposites. Right. So in that sense, Marx said that at the international level, there is no money. But then, you got the sterling system, and I've written a lot about this, and now you have the dollar system. The sterling system functioned basically as an imperial currency, because the sterling system would not have existed had it not been for the surpluses that Britain drew from her non-settler colonies, like British India, chiefly, and exported to Europe and her settler colonies. These were the famous capital exports, right, that Britain. Without such colonies, the United States has never had a stable basis for the dollar as the world's money. And I'm not even going into some of the complications, but anyway, there it is. So one of my jokes is that, people often think of, creating a sort of world money, right? Actually, as long as capitalism exists, you won't get world money. You won't get stable world money. The world money is part of the contradictions of capitalism, or the inability to create a stable world money.
You wanted to make a follow-up remark, Daniel?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I would be very interested to hear your critical reflections on realism. And one thought that comes to my mind is, so Mearsheimer is the one I've read the most of these views, and I quite respect the work he's done, but he does say that, a nation is basically a black box. We're not going to probe around in there. And of course, if you disaggregate the nation, you'll see quite clearly that some people's interests and investments are protected more than others. One example that comes to my mind is just, I think what was it, 1953, when Mossadegh was elected, and then insisted on some of the profits being repatriated, staying in Iran. there was a coup to say no. In fact, capital assets will be kept in private hands and the profits will be extracted. And so, I mean, that's a pretty great, I mean, they didn't do that for everyone in Britain and the United States. They did it for the people who own those assets. And so that's a pretty good example. I mean, classic thing Marxists say that the theory of the state is underdeveloped, but he gives this line that the state is the, what does he say? The
executive committee of the bourgeoisie.
Right, the interest of the bourgeoisie. And that's a great example where, like,
Yes.
somebody did something in their own interest and nope, that was corrected by the most powerful states on earth. So I would very much be interested to hear now, or maybe hopefully in the future.
No, I mean, I'd have to work on it. But let me just, give you one simple example. I mean, I already gave you one. Why write the Israel lobby? Like, why such a systemic need for these realists to write the Israel lobby book? But the second point I would say is, I've also been very grateful to John Mearsheimer for doing particularly the work he's done on the Ukraine crisis and so on. And I've listened to many of his lectures and so on. And I would say that, he's right, of course, that the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault, and he pins it on the expansion of NATO. But he doesn't ask, why is NATO being expanded? What is his explanation? Who is, why are the states doing what they're doing? And if he wants to, if it is just a, anyway, so he just thinks it's an error, but it's not an error. It is a systematic need of, if US imperialism is to continue to exist, then it must have NATO. And for the US imperialism to cease to exist, what has to happen is that there has to be some powerful political force in the United States which is capable of taking state power, which does take state power, and then says the United States government will no longer serve the interests of the big corporations of the United States, but rather of its people. If it does that, then there is absolutely no need for the United States to be aggressive towards the rest of the world. But Mearsheimer cannot envisage all these things. He just thinks it's an error. If he persuades enough people, they will rectify the error. This is not happening, right? So, yeah, that's my immediate response to your question about Mearsheimer.
Charlie.
Yeah, I actually had another question about Mearsheimer and what you were talking about with the Israel lobby. I guess what I perceived, the Israel lobby, the point of the Israel lobby, the book as was sort of, like you said, an error that Mearsheimer was trying to, explain that. But I was confused by you saying that it's because Mearsheimer doesn't understand imperialism. My understanding of his main point was that, not that Israel he doesn't understand Israel in an imperial way, but he thinks that what the US is doing in Israel is actually counterproductive to the US's actual imperial ambitions, and that his sort of realist political theory, like Daniel said, views states as a black box, and so he has to sort of make like a quote unquote like special outside of theory explanation for why the US would do something which seems to be counter to its imperial ambitions, which is comes from the lobby and sort of in diverging economic interests which are interior to the state itself. But I wonder, what about that indicates that he doesn't understand imperialism as opposed to not understanding heterogeneous interests within the state?
Very, very good question. So thanks for that. So I would say that Mearsheimer basically assumes that all states will be internationally aggressive, which is what he means by imperialism. Okay, so the United States, and that, it serves their interest. They should prevail on the rest of the world and so on. So he just assumes that there is a certain innate expansionism, aggression in all states. But that is not what imperialism is. Imperialism is something that is connected with capitalism. It arises from the contradictions of capitalism. It arises from the fact that capitalism, on the one hand, as Daniel pointed out, needs the state, but on the other hand, its needs overspill the boundaries of any given state. And therefore, that state, if it can, needs to control the rest of the world. So capitalist states have a certain type of foreign policy, powerful capitalist states, dominant capitalist states, which you will not see replicated in socialist states, even if they are. So, this whole idea that Russia and the United States were, Soviet Union and the United States were essentially equally aggressive, equally exterminist, as the great historian E.P. Thompson said, this would not be a correct rendition of the actual record of the Cold War, or anything, in which I would say that the Soviet Union's position had always been defensive and that of the United States aggressive. Not because the United States as a state wishes to exert power over all other states and control them. On the contrary, because the United States is a capitalist country with powerful capitalist interests who would like their state to act in ways that smooth their path towards towards acquiring, what would the US corporations want? They want markets abroad. They want raw materials abroad. They want investment outlets abroad, and they want cheap labor, which in our time particularly, but it has always been true, comes from abroad. I often think that people think migration and population is something completely disconnected with capitalism, but this is not so. Everybody who thinks should read, I forget which chapter it is. I think it's chapter 25 of Capital, which is called The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. And most people would imagine that a chapter so entitled would be about, quantities of capital and the return on that and so on. No, it isn't about that. It's about population. And if you read that chapter carefully, you will see that you will conclude no migration, no capitalism. Capitalism cannot do without migration. It is impossible for it to exist, and you will discover why in that chapter. So I forget how I got onto this, but yes, what does imperialism, what do powerful American corporations want their government to do outside their borders? They want their government to discipline other governments in such ways as they will allow American goods to enter freely, they will allow American capital to enter freely and take back profits freely. They would like those countries to produce cheap inputs for their enterprises, wherever they may be, abroad or at home. So one of the things that Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik's recent books on imperialism has done is they have underlined the extent to which the suppression of consumption in the third world, and therefore also of production in the third world, but certainly of consumption in the third world, is absolutely critical to ensuring the cheapness of inputs. Because imagine India developed. Imagine how much iron ore, copper, uranium, just think of all the minerals and so on that you can, wheat, rice, everything that India would demand. And if India demanded it, wouldn't they become much more expensive? Because ultimately the capacity to produce these things is limited. So they want all these things, and imperialist governments are not just abstractly expansionist. They are out to achieve certain clear political purposes. I hope that's clear, Charlie, but if not, please come back with any follow-up.
Yeah, that is clear. I guess the further question I would have that could clarify would be, so Mearsheimer thinks that, what he has to explain away is that he thinks that the US's actions in Israel are actually, counterproductive to the actual.
Yeah. Sorry, I did not answer the question regarding to Israel specifically. So you see, my point about it is that he thinks that the United States is acting in ways that are counterproductive to its natural need to control what happens in the rest of the world, etc. But actually, and looked at another way, the United States actions, looked at it from our point of view, from the point of view of imperialism, the United States actions vis-a-vis Israel do not even require an Israel lobby, although it exists, and I'm sure it adds to that. But for the United States, just because it is imperialist in the way I mean imperialist, not Mearsheimer, for it, Israel is its unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. It is the cat's paw in the Middle East. Without Israel, where would the United States find a loyal ally? Okay. Now, this does not mean to say that, today many people would argue, and I would argue, that basically, the United States is trying to achieve imperial domination in a context where this is impossible. So it does not make sense. But I would say that or let me rephrase that. I mean, some capitalists may argue that from their point of view, this no longer makes sense. But there will be other capitalists to whom it makes sense, and who said that capitalism was always a coherent system. The reason why the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie is that the bourgeoisie is always plural. It's always going to fight with its different parts are going to be fighting with one another, etc., etc. In the United States today, there is definitely a war lobby and a lobby, vis-a-vis China. There is a lobby that will say, let's go to war with China, and another lobby will say, no, let's do business with China. There are definitely two parts to it. So, coming back to Israel, I would say that the United States policy looks incoherent right now, even from the point of view of retaining this unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. But there is also the momentum of the past, with a president like Biden, who spent his entire life backing Israel. He's not going to easily back off from that, right? So anyway, so that's my brief response, is that the United States has independent imperialist reasons to back Israel. Not so the IPAC is not distorting an otherwise rational American policy.
Daniel, you had a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, one thought I had is and I'm really not an expert on this, but this is just the first sort of thought that comes to mind, is if we do disaggregate nations in terms of class, and we do think about flows of money and goods, think about the financial dimension of capital, and don't treat nations as black boxes, we could talk about the weapons lobby instead of the Israel lobby. And then you just look, I mean, it's a money laundering operation. The state, and I'm reluctant to say institutional capture, state capture, because it's not like there was ever a moment when this institution, the state, wasn't captured. But basically you just have a permanent wars everywhere all the time, to deficit spend, to create, a direct line of money to weapons manufacturers. You keep these wars going. And then, of course, whoever's going to buy your weapons is your ally. And that's why we need NATO, is to create a monopoly market for weapons. And so, I mean, if we do crack open that black box and we disaggregate it in terms of class interests and asset owners and their interests and so forth, it's not irrational, and we don't need an exceptional explanation. But again, I'm not an expert. I would just wonder, if we talked about the weapons lobby instead of this or that lobby, Ukraine, NATO, Israel make perfect sense from that perspective.
Yeah.
Bradley?
Sure, thanks. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, so I read your book, oddly enough, last summer. I was on the beach, and I found repeatedly, you said a moment ago that most of what we've heard is basically ahistorical, most of what we've been told. And repeatedly I found, these moments you described in the book, the idea of Bangor by Keynes, and what was it? I wrote a note about it, but I can't get it right now. But more recently, one of the reports about, well, we need to just shift money from the global north to the global south. That will help everyone. and that there's these repeated kind of moments when everyone can observe the truth. And that's what your book was to me repeatedly. Just what? So the direction I want to go with my question is, between your book, you're also an incredible speaker, and I feel I'm so glad that I joined this call. It's really impressive and dynamic. How I joined Class Unity because I was frustrated having these moments when I see that everything that people talk about is basically wrong. It's just a kind of an ahistorical representation that kind of makes sense post hoc, but it's not the actual cause. And reading your book, everything makes sense in a much more kind of coherent way. And I never read any of the other maybe unified theories like blood germs and steel or anything. So this might be maybe me, just your book was the first one I read that blew my mind. But how, as Class Unity, how do we implement this? How can we, it seems to me, I just got to give this book to everybody I know, and they'll say, oh, it makes perfect sense. Everyone is wrong. And we're actually hurting so many people by continuing US policy the way it is, or any other, way. How do you have any ideas? And I know there's not a lot about it in the book, so I hope I'm not asking a question that, is off topic, but as an organization, do you have any recommendations or ideas about turning what for me were so many of these moments into activism, changing minds, without just saying, would you like a copy of Geopolitical Economy?
Well, definitely say, would you like a copy of Geopolitical Economy? But no, seriously, I would say that, this is a really important and interesting question. And I would say that in a certain sense, I've kind of already referred to the answer earlier, which is that in every country, especially in the imperialist countries, but let me rephrase that, in the imperialist countries, and the United States is the belly of the beast there, you have to organize political forces that say that essentially take power in the name of, or take power for the people, and be very clear that power for the people means an end to imperialism, because imperialism itself sustains the power of the bourgeoisie that you are up against. If they did not have the ability to milk not just the American working people, but working people all around the world, if that addition to their strength was not there, they would not be as powerful. And I would also say, to be very clear, that your first fight is national. This is not to say that I'm not for international socialism. Of course, I'm for international socialism. But, people talk about globalization. I think you won't get globalization of the sort of, free movement of people, goods, ideas until we get socialism, because capitalism requires, if nothing else, maintaining the boundary between the imperialist countries and the others. Right? So, and to me, by the way, the closest thing you have to this at the moment is Jill Stein's candidacy. I would also mention Cornel West, but Cornel West is not fighting for any, he's not part of a party, and he's not going to get on the ballot for many people. And I should say also that until I went away to India to observe the elections, I was working fairly closely with them in making their platform. And I would say anti-imperialism. Jill and Cornel are the only anti-war candidates, right? So anti-imperialism has to be at the forefront. It's about class and nation. In a certain sense, you want your country to be, you want the United States to be just an ordinary country, not an imperialist country, not the exceptional country. And you see, and if you were, so I would say that, obviously you want all the things that socialists talk about. You want equality, you essentially you want to organize a productive economy which is also equal and which is not imperialist. That's your task. And I would say that, quite frankly, while most of the Western left has become confined to talking about redistribution and egalitarianism, for a very simple reason, because unless you understand imperialism, you do not, unless you understand imperialism, you do not understand that if you wish to live in a properly peaceful and equal world, you will have to reorganize your economy pretty radically, because right now, a very substantial part of the wealth of this economy, of the US economy, lies in its imperial power. And if that were to be dismantled, then you will have to reorganize your economy on a new productive basis. But I would say that unless that is at the foreground, of your, it's it is in the center of your vision, you will it will be very difficult to differentiate you from various Trumpists who often want to talk about similar aims, but they don't talk about imperialism. In fact, they talk about, the United States is greatest and so on, and etc. So anyway, I mean, to understand imperialism is to realize that, what, all this amazing wealth in imperialist countries is not because imperialist countries are, that much more technologically sophisticated or skilled workers or, better capitalists or whatever. It is because of imperialism. And if that were to go away, and by the way, it is going away at a great rate of knots, because other countries are becoming much more assertive about their interests, necessarily so. Even under quite reactionary governments, simply because in order to stay in power, they must deliver something, however minimum, to people. So that is disappearing very fast. So you have to answer the question how you're going to organize yourself productively. And that means talking about planning. That means talking about political parties, not assuming that somehow some kind of network politics is going to work. That assumes talking about a fairly hefty dose of state level planning. I'm not saying that the state needs to plan every last thing. As I like to joke, the state doesn't necessarily have to plan how many striped dresses we are going to produce this year and how many polka dotted dresses. That can be left to various small operators in the market. But the big stuff, how much electricity are we going to produce? How much how are we going to green the economy? How are we going to produce the transport system, the health system, the education system, the steel, the whatever? All these things are actually big items that are actually quite easily planned. And there would not be too much controversy about it.
Dan, you wanted to make a point about this?
Sure. I guess I wanted to add something and then hear what you think, maybe to elaborate on it or correct it. One thing on this point about the importance of anti-imperialist politics, it seems like many leftist organizations do sort of criticize America's imperialist political role and tendency. And I think that the way, or maybe not many, but well, I guess maybe many, and one, they don't seem to be effective because nobody, rhetorically, practically, because nobody likes to be told that they're the bad guy and they would be a better person if they were in a worse material situation. And so, I mean, one thing I just wanted to add here is that, it's not necessarily in the interest of most Americans, their real wage, their real standard of living, to have their currency, it's not really our currency, be the global reserve currency. It's not in the interest of most Americans, this financialized global dollar hegemony, because financialization isn't in the interest of most Americans. Industry leaves, the so-called strong dollar is terrible if you're employed to making things, because there are no more exports. So you're not going to be employed making things anymore. And so just on this point, what I wanted to add was that, yes, we should say something about imperialism, but it should not come across in this way as though we must be altruistic and be sacrificing.
Correct.
Because that
Correct.
will not be politically efficacious. The case needs to be made clear that we will have a better national standard of living if we disaggregate the black box and we look in there and say, okay, who's pulling the strings for whom, doing what? They're not doing it for most people. And so imperialism is not in the interest of most Americans.
Correct. Exactly. And I would also add one other thing. I think it would actually add to your case if you could argue that actually we have been trying to achieve something that is also impossible. And in the process, we are harming our own interests, because essentially the United States, the financialization that is a necessary part of making the dollar the world's money, which harms the interests of ordinary Americans. And the financialization that goes with it is because without it, the dollar is not a stable system. It cannot be. And the financialization has to occur in order to overcome one of the inherent problems of the dollar. So you're creating new problems as well. I mean, strong dollar, yes, but also the financialization that has gone along with it nothing has been more ruinous for people in the United States than that. It has been centrally responsible for the massive inequality that you see in the United States as well. And also the undermining of the productive economy of the US. And I will say one other thing, which is, and this becomes particularly clear in my Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. Capitalism is past its sell-by date. This also came up in our discussions, I think, when I was in Chicago. Capitalism is past its sell-by date. And in the imperialist countries, the United States loves to think that it is at the frontier of technology. China is stealing our technology. No. China is now making its own technology, while your corporations, who you mollycoddle, to whom you give these lucrative contracts, which, where, you buy a gun that should ordinarily cost a few $1,000s, dozens of thousands of dollars, and that sort of thing. I mean, this kind of swindle that you see in the United States, it is actually also preventing the proper technological development of the United States. Digital technology is one a very good example where this resource, the potential of information and communication technology is best developed if it is done under public auspices, as a public utility. Because it is done under the aegis of private capital, by Meta and Google and what have you, it is being denatured. It is being used for the opposite of welfare, right? We are harming our kids with it. We are harming ourselves with it, precisely because it has to be made to yield a profit, right? So the further development of technology from here on is also, and there are many such instances, and until the same, so-called Marxist, we should not call them Marxists. Sometimes I think we should call them capital worshippers, because they really do believe that capitalism is productively superior, far superior to socialism. And I think this is less and less the case. This is manifestly now not the case in relation to China.
Does anybody have any last questions? And let us know if you're pressed for time, Radhika.
No, I can stay a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I do have one question of my own about production and industry, the deindustrialization of the United States, and the position of the working class in the United States. Reading your book gave me the impression that the reason the United States, or I mean, I don't think this is just an impression, you make the point explicitly, the reason the United States cannot rise to the level of hegemony or imperial power is because of the numerous other states that have and continue to develop their own productive capacities. For me, it would make sense that if the United States wants to, raise the power of the dollar, it would want to maintain and increase its own productive capacities. That would seem to be, a necessary precondition for its own imperial power. But instead of that, we've seen the United States, decline in industry. I mean, I think it can be overstated because the United States is still one of the most productive powers of the world. But I just wonder, what do you think are the main factors what do you think are the main factors of the U.S. industrialization? Why do you think that the political ruling class has allowed it to occur if it necessarily leads to its decline in power? And I guess somewhat of a separate question, what do you think the resulting position is of the American working class specifically, and its own political power, given the state of deindustrialization and de-dollarization?
Okay, so first of all, let me say that if the United States were indeed a great productive power, like Germany once was, or Japan once was, or China is today, then it would have even greater difficulty making its money the world's currency, for the simple reason that because it would have a big export surplus, it would be always taking more dollars back from the rest of the world and therefore there would be not enough dollars for the rest of the world. And this is not the least reason why why let's just confine it to China for now. Why China's currency will not be the world's currency. China does not, when people talk about the dollar, whether there'll be a replacement or the dollar, whether the dollar's hegemony is ending, people say, oh, look, I don't see any other currency on the horizon that can possibly replace the dollar, so the dollar will not be replaced. No. The problem with the dollar is not that it is weakening and another currency is going to arise. The problem with the dollar is that it has severe internal contradictions that are bad for the world, bad for the United States, and it needs to be replaced by something like Bangor. Okay. Exactly how this will be engineered, we can have all sorts of discussions, and I see that even when people start discussing this, there are too many misunderstandings about how money operates at the international level that need to be vanquished before we do so. So that's the first point I want to make, is that, and the United States had this problem briefly in the post-Second World War period. And this is why they also created the Marshall Plan, because they were exporting so much, they were taking back dollars, and the rest of the world didn't have enough dollars. Now, I don't want to talk up the Marshall Plan. It's not what it's often claimed to be. It was very small. It was not critical to Europe's recovery. Europe recovered on its own steam, but that's all separate. There's a couple of wonderful chapters in Gabriel and Joyce Kolko's book. I think it's called The Limits of American Power or something. Excellent chapters on the Marshall Plan, which everyone should read before they say anything about the Marshall Plan. But okay, so that's the first point. And the second point is that, therefore, you were asking, sorry, can you repeat your question? Sorry, just briefly.
Oh, what are the major causes of deindustrialization, and why have the political classes?
That's right. That's right. And so, to me, I would say that several things came together. So I would say the career of Charles Kindleberger has to be more closely examined in order to understand this. And I see that Perry Mehrling has recently written a book, and I've started reading it, and I can say that having gotten well into it, I don't think Perry Mehrling is just adding new layers of mystification to what Kindleberger was really about. And he even he calls his book Money and Empire. But if you actually read Marcelo De Cecco's book Money and Empire, you would understand that essentially what Kindleberger was trying to do was actually going against the grain of what De Cecco was arguing. But anyway, the point is that Kindleberger always he thought somehow that the dollar could mimic the sterling's role. But I don't think Kindleberger ever appreciated the extent to which Britain's colonial surpluses were critical to the system. So he just thought that by simply expanding the financial sector, making broad and deep financial markets, and this is a phrase that continues to be used by all the dollar boosters to this day, and it comes from him. And so the going off gold, lifting capital controls, and essentially deregulating finance were central to this vision. And that is essentially what happened beginning in the 1970s and particularly accelerating in the 1980s. But the big turning point came with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, because what that has done, and since that, therefore 1999, if you actually plot a graph of international capital flows, the big spike comes only after the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which is laid then the groundwork for the 2008 crisis and the bubble that preceded it. Without the repeal of Glass-Steagall, you would have never had, it was like the mother of all bubbles, right? And you would never have had it. So this, it's been slowly, as I say, evolving and so on. But essentially, the United States had been going in a financialized direction in this particular fashion. But there is a second factor, which is that, to my mind, something that has become much clearer to me when I wrote Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War than it was before, which is that capitalism is past its sell-by date. That essentially, and the reason for that is, in the early years of neoliberalism, even many Marxists thought that neoliberalism would strengthen capitalism. And people even were writing, like Gerard Dumenil and Dominique Levy wrote their book Capital Resurgent as late as like 2005 or 6 or something like that, So just, anyway. So the point is they thought this was going to happen. But 40 years into neoliberalism, it's very clear that neoliberalism has actually shown us just how senile and incapable of being productively dynamic capitalism has become. So what you've seen is that in the United States and in the UK, instead of using the new freedoms to invest more and etc. and produce more, capital has actually shrunk its productive footprint in these countries and outsourced production. And remember, this is not even FDI, it is outsourcing, which means that you are basically saying, we don't want to produce. We don't want to produce in the United States. We don't want to produce outside the United States. We want somebody else to produce and sell to us. And that's what outsourcing is. It's not FDI, not to be confused with FDI. So this has, as I say, deregulation has been another part. And finally, I would say that you see, because what financialization does is it concentrates investable money into ever smaller hands. And then it gives these small number of people a privileged position in the financial sector in such a way that whenever there is a boom, they gain the most. And whenever there is a bust, they lose the least. And this is based, I mean, if you were to look at it, it would be no matter how much you finesse it, it is essentially a form of insider trading, because you are basically benefiting from your privileged position, your privileged access to information, etc., etc. And you basically, because you are market makers, you are not market takers. And once you have markets, and financial markets are prime examples, which are made by a small number of players, they will, of course, it's like, gaming, you structured the game to favor you. So once that happens, they will keep investing in the financial sector alone, expecting to make those high profits. And then, or making ordinary things like shirts or shoes or even computers seems like, come on, do you really think you expect me to do that? No, let the Chinese do it, right? So,
one last question from Daniel.
Okay. Okay. So, one thing I really like about your work is that you really hold the attention to political economy, so history, politics, but especially economy. And so I want to invite you to say something about maybe the state or the history of Marxism. And my question is inevitably coming from a perspective which is sort of bound and focused in the United States. So I just beg your pardon for that. Maybe it seems different. It probably seems different to me or to us than it does to you, but still, I think you could say something about this, namely the way in which political economy has vanished for a lot of Marxism, at least for what passes as Marxism. But also, I want to read one statement that you make actually in your new book in the conclusion, and just so anyone would know, this is on page 225 on Class and Left Politics Today about the left. So I want to ask you about Marxism today and the left. And it's the first paragraph in this section. I think it's a great statement. So I just want to read it out and invite you to say something about the left. So you write, with the conversion of the historic parties of the working class to neoliberalism, all mainstream politics has turned into a politics of neoliberalism. The main parties form a solid cross-party phalanx, a veritable establishment operating across parties, corporate foundations, think tanks, and even countries. Their unified discourse is policed by forms of censorship more effective than any in the most dystopian vision of allegedly totalitarian societies, operating with the carrots of preferment and pay, and the sticks of being silenced, as Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and Edward Snowden most famously have been, or shunned, as with so many critical writers branded as conspiracy theorists or dangerous or simply loony. The neoliberal establishment also equates the politics of Johnson or Trump with the class politics of left leaders like Corbyn and Sanders or Maduro as versions of populism, striking both major forms of challenge to their power. Now, here's the line that really sort of, gets me in an interesting way. So many sections of the left also act as freelance vigilantes for this establishment, particularly by attacking those questioning this neoliberal consensus, whether they call radical supporters of the rights of Palestinians anti-Semitic or accuse critics of wars of democracy promotion as dictatorphilia or Putinversteher, as they say in Germany. So this statement about the way in which the left is doing the sort of dirty work of the establishment for free, it really, really hit the nail on the head from my perspective. And so what's up with the left and what's up with Marxism?
Yeah, I mean, this is like that's a huge, huge question. And I would say that there are several elements of this scenario. So one of them is that it seems to me that, my first book was actually entitled Intellectuals and Socialism, and it was about the intellectuals of the British Labour Party. And in it, I trace the history of the connection between intellectuals and the historic parties of the working class, going back to Marx and Engels, but also onward, so that, the overwhelming majority of thinking people tended to side with parties of the left, and in fact, so much so that there's somewhere, I forget where it is now, but John Stuart Mill calls the Conservative Party the stupid party, and the Liberal Party and later on the Labour Party were the thinking man's party, right? This connection is now broken. And the way in which it broke is also interesting, because over time, what happened is, on the one hand, yes, well, first of all, the professional managerial class expanded, and that is effectively the intellectual class today. It has expanded massively. And so much so that it has now taken over all politics, in the sense that whether you look at conservative parties or the Republicans or the Democrats, whether you look at the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, they're dominated not by, the Conservatives are not dominated by business people and so on. The Labour Party is not dominated by workers. They are all, as parties, who are their MPs? They are lawyers, doctors, professionals, professors, whatever they are. That's who they are. These people essentially have, and you see, this shift began to occur in the 1970s, I would say. And this then shifted conservative parties to the neoliberal right. And then rather than fighting them from the left, the historic parties of the working class also shifted to the right. And they are now part of this, as I say, the same sort of intellectual class. And like I say, so that's one thing. And for shifting to the right, essentially, they sort of, for historic parties of the left, what they did is they accepted neoliberalism, but then added on it a layer of what I call social liberalism, a very tokenistic social liberalism, in which you say you care about women and Black people and so on, but you only deal with that by promoting a small number of them tokenistically to prominent positions. But everybody else, their situation does not change, so they remain as they are. So that's one element of it. And I would say that this process has become easier because of some very deep-rooted problems on the left. And I would say personally, of course, there is in the imperialist countries, there was, of course, the whole issue of imperialism. Imperialism has allowed, the working class people and generally the populations of imperialist countries have benefited from imperialism. So they have tended not to have a critique of imperialism, right? So there is always that structural factor. But I would say that, given that Marxism is the most important and intellectually powerful tradition within the left, the denaturing of Marxism is central to it. And I would say the denaturing of Marxism began already by the 1880s. It was happening. And the denaturing is essentially trying to understand, after the new marginalist revolution, over the next many decades, you got several generations of people who called themselves Marxists for one reason or another, but essentially they were educated in Neoclassical Economics. And once you accept that to any extent, you cannot actually make head or tail of what Marx is saying in Capital. They cannot understand, they understand to some extent what exploitation is, but beyond that, they understand very little. They, for example, do not understand what value is. So to me, and essentially, since then, what we've also had is an attempt to try to, what so-called critical Marxists or people who call themselves Marxists in the intellectual classes, what they do is they raid the treasure trove of Marxist thought and bring this or that little bauble to the main part of the intellectual tradition and say, you see, I'm contributing this to you. I'm bringing this, I'm bringing that. So they are raiding Marx, and then they are using that for their own advancement. But they do not understand Marx. They do not understand what Marx was about. They do not understand dialectics. They do not understand contradiction. They do not understand value. They do not understand what Marx meant when he said that the movement towards communism is the real movement. What does he mean by that? They don't get it. Anyway, so to me, what has gone wrong with the left goes very deep. And for that, I mean, but and it would be really great if people rediscovered what Marx really meant. But I would say also that to some extent, history itself will require these people to understand. Now, more and more people are realizing the reality of the receding of US power, because it's manifest, it's clear. It's there before everybody. So anyway, maybe I'm not making too much sense at this point, but that the question that you ask is probably worth writing a whole book about. Maybe that's what I will do. But it is a very important question. And to me, and all the compromises the left has made on imperialism, people like Keir Starmer, I'm watching this election here, it's absolutely nauseating that, he's not only moved the Labour Party so far to the right that it is indistinguishable what he is going to do, which is so different from what Rishi Sunak will do. But of course, none of them also understand imperialism. And one of the things that ails, am I bullish on Galloway? Well, I think Galloway gets a lot of things right, although I'm not sure I would trust him on questions of feminism. So But anyway, I mean, he is having an effect. I would say that because people are here are absolutely enraged about the way in which the main political parties are dealing with Gaza, and he gets it, you know. But anyway, so yeah, there's a whole bunch of different things one could talk about. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming to speak to us, Radhika. Before we sign off, is there anything you'd like us to know about by way of upcoming projects or events, and where can people find you online?
Okay, at the I'm working on my website. When it's ready, it'll be called radhikadesai.com. But until that happens, you can always look at my academia.edu page, which I try to keep updated. And most of my works you can download them on the academia.edu website. So please take a look at that. And of course, I'm very easy to find if anybody ever wanted to contact me. Just Radhika Desai, Manitoba, and you'll probably find my email address. So.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you especially to our speaker.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great set of questions. Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to talk with you. And yeah, good luck with your projects.